Okay, thanks, James. Okay, thanks for being here, everybody. I'm Grace Glynn. I'm the department botanist with Vermont Fish and Wildlife. And we're gonna jump right in here. I think you all know about team protocol here, and the chat is available for questions as we go. So we will stop a couple times throughout. So feel free to put your questions in there, and we'll also have time at the end to answer some questions. And for now, if you'd like to introduce yourself and put your name in the chat, that would be great, along with your town or whoever you're with. Okay, so I work with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Our mission is the conservation of all fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats. I think some people don't realize that this expands to plants. So we have a broad mission, outside of just game species, from natural communities to whole habitats, kind of thinking more holistically in landscape scale, or to more understudied groups like invertebrates. And this conservation work, is for all of the people of Vermont into the future. So during this presentation, we'll kind of be focused on these two here, communities and landowners. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the rare plants of Vermont. What are they? Where are they? And why are they rare? I'll talk a bit about the work of the Vermont Natural Heritage Inventory, the program that I'm in within the department. And then conservation actions. What are we doing about all of this, all these rare plants? And then Jens will take it away briefly for some discussion of town work on the municipality level. So I just want to start by kind of stepping back and thinking about the flora of Vermont. So meaning all of the plants that exist in the state of Vermont, that's our flora. And maybe you could just think of this in your head, but does anyone know how many native plant species we have in the state of Vermont? And we'll say native and vascular plants, so not including mosses and liverworts. So we do dabble a little bit in bryophytes at the department. And I'll tell you, we have about 1,600 species of native plants. If you were to add non-native species, that would be about 300 more. And that's a lot of diversity for a pretty small state. I think there are a few reasons. One is probably the elevation gradient that we have in Vermont. So we have places from up in the Alpine Meadow or the Alpine Krumholtz, Camel's Hump, all the way down into the warm Champlain Valley, kind of oaky hills, and the whole elevation gradient in between. So that offers kind of places for huge diversity of species to exist. A lot of it probably is owed to our bedrock as well. We have complex bedrock geology in Vermont, including a lot of calcareous bedrock, which just tends to support a lot more plant diversity. So I bring this up and kind of start with this because, one, it's just really cool that we have that much plant diversity in Vermont, but it also means that towns across the state have distinctive floras. So in Underhill, you're going to have this really distinct suite of species and distinct suite of rare species that are probably much more northern affinity, kind of boreal species. Whereas in Vergennes, you're going to have this different suite of rare species that are much more southern affinity. It's like black gum and yellow oak and chestnut oak and Virginia chain fern and clay plain, swamps and really different characteristic species. And I think this is really important because it kind of is one of the things that gives people a sense of place wherever they are, is getting to know the species that are characteristic of their town, kind of gets them more in touch with that place. And so rare plants play into that. They have distinct distributions across the state. So that's a lot of plants. How do we keep track of all of these? And this is really a foundational goal of of heritage inventory programs is to kind of know what all of these different species are doing on the ground, what is their status. And so to do this, we at the department assign ranks to all of our species using methodology from NatureServe. NatureServe is the umbrella organization under which all heritage programs in most of the states and in Canada operate. And that's really important because it gives us consistent protocol across states. So I can call up the main botanist and say, hey, what's your rank for buffalo berry? We rank it as S3 uncommon, but we're kind of seeing some declines. And they say, oh yeah, we rank it as S1 and we moved it from S2 and so on. So it's really kind of an important piece of our methodology. We use these S ranks. S is for subnational, so it can be state or province. And it ranges from S5, the most common, so that would be something like red maple, to S1, which is the rarest of the rare, a species that has usually 6 or fewer populations across the state, and is really at risk of extirpation. There are some other ranks like SH, historical, so that would be something that hasn't been seen in over 25 years, but is could potentially be relocated or refound, but has been searched for. And then there are some other ranks like SU, which is unrankable. And that's kind of an important one just to mention because that would be used for species that we just don't have enough data for. We just really don't know what is their true rarity. Maybe nobody is paying attention to them. This is the case for a lot of cryptic species like mosses, and more work needs to be done. So it just speaks to the importance of doing this inventory work because we can't even rank some species, and having accurate ranks is really important because this is how we prioritize conservation. And we have limited resources for conservation for plants, so it's really important to be putting it in the right place. Our ranks go into our rare species list, which is available online. We'll post the link. And this is updated every few years. We've got an update to our rare species list coming in May, so something to look out for. And there's a lot of good information on this list if you're involved in project review or just interested in the status of rare plants. So there's that S rank that I talked about. There's also the state status column, and this is going to have T and E in it, which stands for threatened or endangered. So any species that has something in this column, you'll know that that species is protected by our state endangered species law. And so for any of those species, you would need a takings permit to conduct a project that is going to impact that species in some way. Federal status would be federally protected species, but you're not going to see that much for plants because we only have 3 plant species in the entire state that are federally protected. And actually one of those, the northeastern bulrush, is going to be delisted. So we'll only have 2, which is a good thing that it's going to be delisted because we've found enough populations to say, okay, it probably doesn't need this protection. And then lastly, this last column is kind of an important one for us in the plant conservation world because text in these rows means that these are regionally rare species. FC stands for Flora Conservanda, which is a list of regionally rare species that's developed by the Native Plant Trust, one of our partner organizations. And so Division 1 means very regionally rare. And so that's important in context because it's we're probably going to treat a species differently if it's very regionally rare compared to if it's common in all of the surrounding northeastern states, though of course it's nuanced. Just to give you a visual of this example, this is the Green Mountain maidenhair fern, a state threatened species and a globally rare and regionally rare species. This is a fern that grows only on serpentine bedrock, which is a rare type of bedrock. So that means it's just really restricted to those areas. And this is, it's kind of a cool setting. Some of these sites are on abandoned asbestos mines. So this is my colleague Morgan going out to check out some Green Mountain maidenhair fern on the tailings piles of the asbestos mine. So that is just a short excerpt of our list. It's really quite long. We track 600 species of rare and uncommon plants. A lot of those are uncommon or S3 plants, so we don't regulate those, but it's really important that we track them because of them are on the cusp of being rare or on the cusp of being common, and we want to be able to accurately rank those again. So tracking populations and getting new populations from consultants and botanists who are out there is really important. And then that subset of listed species protected by law is 163 of those species. Okay, so why are all of these plants rare in the first place? There are a lot of different reasons, and some, like we talked about the Green Mountain Maidenhair Fern, are just real specialists. They are rare on the landscape. They probably have always been rare on the landscape because they're relying on these very specific places. Another example would be like rhodiola, which is a rare succulent. It's medicinally used pretty commonly. We only have two populations, and they're both on boreal calcareous cliffs. This is an important thing to know about a species because it affects how we take conservation action. You know, it's going to be really important to focus on conserving those places in the case of these species. And we don't necessarily want to make them more common either. You know, if we know that they are naturally rare on the landscape, that's going to influence our conservation goals. Kind of conversely, there are species that were certainly more common on the landscape at one time, but have declined because of habitat loss, development, fragmentation. An example of this is the wild lupin or sundial lupin. This is our native species of lupin, and we have only one population remaining, though we know that they were more common in the Champlain Valley, according to old writings and herbarium collections. But because of habitat loss, really in the Burlington, Colchester area, they've lost a lot of their habitat. And we've also lost some of the landscape processes that this species relies on, like fire. So this is a photo here of the pitch pine forest where that was probably natural habitat for the wild lupin. And because of fragmentation in those sandplain forests, there are a lot of, you know, and just because of fire suppression, that process has kind of been lost from the landscape. And this is just a visual. So this is what some of those sandplain forests look like, and a visual of just how many rare species we have in our fragments, our remaining fragments of sandplain forest. And this is a map from Colchester. You can see kind of the encroaching development, but in those undeveloped areas, just lots and lots of rare species. And in this particular area, there are actually controlled burns that are done that have, I think, allowed a lot of these species to persist on the landscape. And here's another visual, kind of the then and now. A lot of these green rare plant polygons. Oh, I should have mentioned that all of the green polygons are rare plants. The orange polygons are uncommon species, and the purple is state significant sandplain forest. And here, a lot of these green polygons that are rare plant occurrences are now historic because you can see the habitat has just been eliminated. So we go back and we kind of search around the roadsides, and sometimes there will be persisting plants here and there, but a lot of that habitat is gone. So that I think really remains the largest threat to our rare plants is that development and habitat loss. Okay, a couple other reasons why plant species might be rare. Hydrologic alteration, I lumped this into habitat loss because the damming of our rivers had a huge influence on river shore habitats, and we have a lot of rare plants of river shores. One example is Robbins's milk vetch. This is a variety of Astragalus robbinsii that was known from a site on the Winooski River and nowhere else in the world, just this one site. The site was inundated for hydropower a long time ago, like early 1900s, and the population was destroyed, which resulted in an extinction. Um, we don't have many extinctions from Vermont, but this is one that was known nowhere else in the world. And so this is this kind of sad map from Nature Reserve Explorer showing that we think that species is extinct. It hasn't been seen in over 100 years. This is a great website also if you want to kind of get the bigger picture of plant distribution, see kind of the regional rarity of plants that typically all the states that support that species will be, lit up according to the commonness or rarity. Another reason species might be rare is that they're at the edge of their range. And we have a lot of examples of this. One is scarlet oak, which is just a more southern species, so common in Massachusetts. And the Go Botany pages are really useful for this. I always scroll down. If you scroll down to the bottom, you can see the rarity of a species in all of the New England states, which is just a quick and really useful comparison. It's kind of striking that in Massachusetts, the species is super common, but here we rank it as S1. And you might say, oh, okay, well, it's just like a political boundary issue. It's not really as important to conserve those edge of range species. But in fact, we know that populations at the edge of their range oftentimes have distinctive genetic makeup and have adaptive genomes that are very different from the center of the range and that are probably going to be important in adaptation to rapid climate change. We want to give these species the best shot they can at moving around as climate shifts. And so conserving those edge of range species or populations is important. A couple climate change related things. I think sometimes we think, oh, climate change is just warming and that's causing declines, but it's actually a lot more complicated than that. And one example is our orchids that are in decline. We have a lot of orchids in Vermont. We have over 50 species of native orchid, which is kind of remarkable. The majority of those are on our rare species list. And a lot of them are in decline. And this is a trend that we're seeing actually regionally, not just in Vermont. One of the most kind of iconic and mysterious examples of this is the fairy slipper orchid, Calypso bulbosa. This is a species that used to be fairly common in swamps across the state. We had 22 populations known. And if you look back at the herbarium sheets, it's just like sheets full of orchids plastered all over these sheets. But in the 80s and 90s, they started to dwindle. The populations were becoming a lot smaller. They were dwindling down to one plant. Populations were disappearing. And then in 2001, the last remaining leaf of Calypso was seen in a cedar swamp in the Northeast Kingdom, and we haven't seen the species in the state since. And we don't exactly know what's going on with the species, why it declined so rapidly. There are probably a bunch of things going on, like deer browse and hydrology. But one thing that we think might be happening is we don't really understand the effects of climate change on soil fungal communities, and orchids are reliant on mycorrhizal fungi to even germinate and start growing. So kind of an illustration of how much work there is to be done to really understand the underlying causes of species declines and then start to figure out what we want to do about it. Another example would be the early thimbleweed. We have one remaining population of this plant, which is in the buttercup family, population on the Winooski River. And we're realizing that they really seem to do poorly with hot, dry summers. And this is an example of a population in severe decline. So we've sort of started to do seed collection and population augmentation planting out some transplants into little micro habitats at the same site that we think might be a little more resilient to those drought years. Okay, so that's kind of a rare plant primer. Before we move on, any questions?
Hi, folks. My name's Dave. I'm going to be popping on a couple times during our breaks to ask your questions to Grace. This will be a quick reminder right here. We've got a couple of these breaks planned. And as Grace is presenting, please feel free to write your questions in the chat. And since we have so many folks in attendance today, it'll be a little more efficient. I'll be able to see those questions and read them out. So Grace, we've got 2 questions for you at this break. So first one is really more coming from a comment. So Bernie is asking about genetics of our rare plants, and the specific concern is with respect to lupine. And you were talking about lupine, and the concern is genotypes from the Midwest could cross with our native populations and compromise them in some way, maybe rendering them less fit for our environment here in Vermont. Can you respond to that comment, or do you have any thoughts or concerns about lupine genetics in that way?
Yeah, that's a good point, Bernie. I would agree. So genetic swamping or genetic pollution of our native populations is a particular concern for species like wild lupin, where we only have one population. For other plant species where we have a lot of them, they're not likely to get swamped by, say, somebody plants like one plant from Prairie Moon, and most of their seeds are sourced from the Midwest. It's not likely going to have an effect on like sugar maples because there are just so many of them. I worry about this with our rare plants, especially, yeah, the most rare and kind of like bottlenecked species. Um, and I'm glad you bring it up because it comes up a lot with people wanting to plant rare species, and I think there's this instinct that, oh, we can sort of save these species by planting them out. But the reality is that there are pretty big genetic risks to doing that, namely the genetic contamination of our native populations. Unfortunately, we don't have a great understanding of what that looks like. But the good news is that there is a PhD student doing a study on native lupin on this exact question, and we're awaiting the results of that. I'm really looking forward to seeing what he finds because he's basically looking at like what are the so he's doing a genetic study of all of the different sort of disjunct populations of wild lupin in the Northeast, and we don't even know if they're genetically distinct. So that's like a really important first question to know. And then, yeah, what is the genetic diversity of those populations? If we think about population augmentation or reintroduction of that species, what do we use for seeds? We have accessions in the seed bank with the Native Plant Trust from populations in Colchester. So yeah, stay tuned for more information on that.
Great. Thank you, Grace. And thank you, Bernie. There's a comment that maybe it'd be helpful to have some kind of statement on our rare plant website. Okay, so we'll move on to a question from Jack, which relates to planting out uncommon species. So Jack is wondering if when a plant is listed under a state rank, noted to have only a few occurrences, are these occurrences only naturally occurring? And the example is with tulip tree, which is listed as endangered. Jack has planted 3 tulip trees on the property in the past decade. So wondering if those count towards occurrences or if it's only wild occurrences.
They do not count. So we only track natural populations, and this gets a bit complicated with species like tulip tree. And so we rely a lot on context. And what I mean by that is there's a potential to find populations of species that are on our list, like butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa, is on our list as state historic. And it gets a little tricky if we find a population on a roadside of that species. We want to be able to know whether it's naturally occurring or a garden escapee, because we do not want to be tracking planted species or garden escapes. It's tricky for a number of species, like American plum, Prunus americana is tricky because nobody really knows if our populations of that species are native or not. So we rely a lot on context and yeah, we don't regulate populations that we think could be introduced or old rootstock from a planted plum. We've come across that before and we don't regulate those populations. Good question.
Thank you, Grace. Okay, so we're going to move on, but definitely keep asking those questions. There'll be another opportunity for questions. So please put those in the chat as we go. And back to you, Grace.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dave. And I think somebody asked about rare plant forms, which I forgot to put in. So I'll just say now that we have an online reporting form or it's a PDF or Word doc, but it is online if you search for Vermont rare plant reporting form. And we love to get those from the public and in fact rely a lot on community science and members of the public as well as consultants and our work in the department to put those new occurrences into our database. So it's super important. All right. So what is the Vermont Natural Heritage Inventory? What do we do? Well, inventory is right in the name, and I just wanted to make sure to highlight the importance of this work. I think sometimes there's this idea that, oh, these small states like Vermont are so well botanized and we kind of know where everything is. And it's true that we have so many great botanists in the state, but there is a lot out there that's not mapped. And a big part of our work is trying to do those inventories on the ground and increase our understanding of what is out there, where is it, what's going on. So this was a great day that my colleague Matt Peters and I had in Milton. We had landowner permission from this great landowner with a bunch of red cedar woodlands on his parcel. And over the course of the day, we found like 4 populations of state listed species that weren't previously known. And so we're able to add that data to our database and then, refine our ranks and get a better understanding of what we should be listing or not. And it's just really valuable. So we're doing a pretty big push to focus on private lands, of course, if we have permissions. We also revisit a lot of populations. So this is my predecessor, Bob Pop, on the right, on top of Mansfield, visiting a population of the globally rare Boots rattlesnake root. We try to revisit populations, depending on the species, but at least every 20 years. It's pretty difficult to keep up with them, which is why we rely on volunteers a lot through the Native Plant Trust. But we were going back to scope out this population to see if we might be able to collect seeds. So really regionally kind of imperiled species, and we're lying down because we didn't want to trample them. Conserved lands are also important in our monitoring efforts. This is Franklin Bog, huge wetland complex, and we went out here for a day to try to re-find a population of Virginia chain fern, which is a state threatened fern that hadn't been seen in the bog in over 100 years. So people had searched for it. This is what it looks like. It's kind of like a poor fen up there. And we spent all day walking, covering as much ground as we could. And we got really lucky as we were heading out. We stumbled upon this kind of like cedar swamp area, these blue areas. And there was the Virginia chain fern. And so we were able to say, oh, nobody just had found it because this place is so vast in the past 100 years, but it's still here. It seems to have been, doing well for the past 100 years. And then we're able to, actually with this species, we were able to downrank it to S2 from S1 because we found a few new populations over the past couple of years. This is an example of what our mapping looks like after we do some of these inventories in our rare plant hotspots. It's an Alpine zone. And so for each of these polygons, we have information, a lot of population information in our database and really specific locality information, which allows us to go back and allows us to pick up on long-term trends, which is a really important part of the work. Another focus of my work is project review in a few different capacities. One is takings permits for listed species. So those are those T&E species. Um, and always the first step in this work is working with applicants on avoidance and minimization of impacts to rare species. If impacts can't be avoided, then they're issued a permit, and we write up those permit conditions and try to find a way to work with the applicant to protect the plants, but also, allow working landscapes to persist. A lot of That's sort of the context of a lot of our permits. This is an example in a quarry where we have some pretty rare disturbance adapted species that seed bank in these soils. And then when somebody comes in to quarry, the seeds germinate, and all of a sudden you have a bunch of listed plants popping up. So we were able to work with this applicant to avoid a portion of the population of this very rare S1 bush clover, and then also to develop a mitigation plan. So they ended up transplanting about 500 plants out of harm's way before they started quarrying. We also work a lot on Section 248. So that's their utilities legal process, and any utilities project that goes through Section 248 is or many of them are going to require a rare plant inventory. And we protect all rare plants through that process, not just listed species. We also work with landowners a lot to go out, and this takes a bunch of different forms. Sometimes when landowners have rare plant polygons mapped on their land, they want to know, hey, are these plants actually here? And can you give us more information? Can you give us more refined mapping on where exactly these plants are? And I'm more than happy to go out and do those surveys for folks. And a lot of times it will result in me saying, okay, you actually don't have any rare plants here. And then they are able to move forward knowing that. And it makes it a lot easier for people to plan, for land use on their parcels. And this was an example. This was actually another utilities example. I go out with a lot of power line companies, and I was putting tiny little flags on this little gentian. This is a microheterotrophic gentian that is mycorrhizal, and they were doing veg management kind of all around these little plants, which actually like an open condition. So oftentimes it can be a win-win situation with these utilities. This is another power line cut and an example of how some of our plants are management dependent. So they need a lot of sun, they need kind of an open condition, they need exposed mineral soil. This is climbing fern, which is kind of a bizarre fern. We have only one population in the state, and it's located directly under a power line in the middle of a power line cut. And so the utility company needs to keep those trees back, and we want to keep the conditions kind of open for this fern, which likes the sun. And so every day, or sorry, every year, we'll go out and trim back the trees, kind of very carefully trim around the fern, and the utility company is happy because then they don't have the trees growing into their lines. This is actually Art Gilman, who wrote The Flora of Vermont, and kind of shows you how dedicated he is to fern conservation. He was sawing down these trees himself. This is another management example up at Alberg Dunes State Park, working to protect our population, one of our two populations of Champlain beach grass, which is a rare variety or subspecies of the coastal beach grass. So we took down this old fence that was kind of blocking the sand and preventing this natural landscape process from occurring, this natural sand deposition, and replaced it with this fence that allows that sand to be dumped up on the dunes and keeps woody plants from encroaching. And we've noticed that the population seems to be thriving. And that work was done in conjunction with Native Plant Trust with funding from the Cotyledon Fund. I won't talk about this too much, but we also do some in situ conservation We store seeds of all of our regionally rare species in a long-term vault with the Native Plant Trust in Massachusetts. That's a really critical way that we conserve genetic diversity over time. And it allows us to take accessions from that seed bank and grow out plants from our native populations if we want to do population augmentation. We did this, as I said, with the anemone on the Winooski, the cut-leaved windflower. And so we kind of know what the genetic material is that we're using for that work. And we've also done this with the federally endangered and globally rare Jessup's milk vetch, which grows in only 3 sites, all on the Connecticut River. Um, and then just a note about species rescue. I've seen this sort of in the news a little bit more lately and kind of has a nice ring to it, but we at the department really focus on conservation of existing plant populations first and foremost, and view the movement of plants as really a last resort. And the reason for that is that a lot of plants do not transplant well, and success rates are pretty low. An example of this would be really any orchid, since they rely so closely on specific fungal associates. But our southern twayblade, we have 3 populations in bogs and black spruce woodland bogs or swamps. So for species like that, we know that it's really important to conserve that habitat for them, rather than viewing plants as, disjunct objects kind of floating in space. They're really reliant on the setting where they naturally occur. Questions, Dave?
All right, thank you, Grace. So 2 quick questions for you. First of all, do you use iNaturalist at all in your work to help track or document rare plants?
Yeah, we do. The Heritage Inventory has an iNaturalist account, and we try to keep tabs on what people are finding because we have lots of observations of rare plants. And if you, as an iNaturalist user, allow your observations to be added to the Vermont Atlas of Life, we actually have access to seeing the locations of those. So our rare species will be automatically obscured in iNaturalist, which is great, to protect them, especially sensitive species that are prone to poaching. I think that's really important. And I tend to obscure all of my observations automatically. But anyway, the work that the Vermont Center for Eco Studies and the Vermont Atlas of Life is doing is really great. And for some species, it's been super helpful in ranking. I mean, I was just trying to rank Pyrola chlorantha. Oh, what's it called? It's like a little, I don't remember the common name. Anyway, pyrola, you probably know pyrolas. It's a little ericaceous plant, like a little wintergreen. And we were all sitting around like, I don't think we've seen Pyrola chlorantha anywhere in Vermont. I've seen it like once. And then we looked on iNaturalist and we were able to verify it's a pretty easily identifiable one by photos, which not all of them are. But we were able to see like, oh wow, people are seeing this plant around Vermont, and here are the parts of the state where they're seeing it. And so next summer we're going to go out and find some of those populations, and it affected what rank we chose. So it's great. I'm a fan.
Great. Okay, next question. Do you target outreach to private landowners if they have special features that you know of?
Yeah, we could do a lot more if we had more capacity. I do this with priority parcels though, and I do a lot of outreach, combination of writing letters and calling people, um, and asking for permission. A lot of those parcels are places where we know that they're probably rare species and we'd like to get permission to survey. Um, yeah, I it can be, yeah, there are mixed results, and it takes a lot of time, and one thing that's super helpful is the Native Plant Trust's work on that, just because it's so hard to find the time to do all the land. I have a very long list of private parcels that I'd love to survey and just don't have the time um, to talk to them all or get a response. But Native Plant Trust does a lot of that work through their plant conservation volunteer program, which if any of you are interested in getting involved in surveys, that would be the place to go. They do incredible work.
Great. Okay, so one more question, shifting our focus to public areas. High alpine species. So in areas where there's high traffic for hiking trails, how is that impacting the known rare plants in the alpine zone? And how are they doing?
Yeah, great question. It's it's actually really great news, I think, in that regard, because the Alpine Stewardship Program through GMC, I think, is a real success story. People, so as you probably know, there are summit stewards up there most days, um, on Camel's Hump and Mansfield. Um, and I think that it's worked really well. I see that there's sort of an ethic around the way people operate in the Alpine zone, which is kind of remarkable. And I don't see people going off trail a lot. Um, so it seems to be a kind of a messaging success story where people know that the plants are fragile up there. I see sometimes I'll see people with dogs off leash, and people are usually pretty receptive to, yeah, maybe they don't know how many rare species are around. But yeah, I'm really pleased that that effort is underway and that people are up there. It's kind of a comfort to know that those summit stewards are up there. So for a lot of our alpine species, they seem to be doing well. And they're kind of the first ones that we think of when we think of effects of climate change, like, oh, those plants they must be really in decline. They're just like nowhere, they have nowhere to go in these islands in the sky. Um, a lot of them seem to be holding steady for now, like mountain sandwort, is doing really well. In fact, grows right kind of in the middle of the trail. Diapensia is doing pretty well up there. At the same time, it's difficult. Long-term monitoring of these species is difficult. And there can be, for some of these species, I think, a tipping point where when the effects of climate change sort of hit a certain point, we don't really know how they're gonna react to that. So there is some sort of plot, like more focused long-term monitoring work going on Mansfield, which is really important.
Thanks, Grace. All right, folks, so we have two more short segments. So we're going to jump right back in, and just about 15 minutes remaining. So I see a question just came in, but we'll hold that for the next break. So back to you, Grace.
Okay, great. I'm gonna wrap up fairly soon, so we should have a little bit of time. Um, so I want to talk a little bit about towns and kind of what towns can do when it comes to rare plants. I see a lot of towns conducting natural resource inventories on a town-wide basis, which I just think is so great because it gives municipalities a holistic view of what are the priority areas for conservation across the town, and just what do we have um, that's special in the town. So an example of that, well, typically a rare plant inventory would be kind of built into one of these inventories, though it depends on the consultant. So, um, I would look for a strong botanist if you're looking for a consultant and you're interested in plants in particular. This is an example of a inventory that Brett Engstrom did. He's an excellent botanist. He did this for the town of Woodstock and found all of these rare species across the town. And of course, usually these include only a small subset of private parcels. And so that's important to kind of think about what are the priority private parcels if we really want to know the suite of rare plants in this town. So a lot of these hadn't been known before Brett did his inventory of the town. The other thing would be coordinating with me at the Heritage Inventory. Um, to kind of get an idea of where rare plants are likely to be. And another place this can be done is the ANR Atlas. I like to use the atlas to just visualize where the rare plants are mapped in a certain place. The rare plants are in green and rare animals are in red. So looking at Brattleboro, you'd say, oh, well, okay, the retreat meadows is obviously a real hotspot for rare plants. So anything, around there with similar habitat is probably going to contain rare species. And then also just being aware that just because there's nothing mapped over here doesn't mean that there's nothing there. There may have never been a survey there, and that I think is a reason why it's really valuable to coordinate with us early on, because oftentimes I can tell you, oh, that doesn't really look like promising habitat, or oh yeah, there's like a basin swamp there that I think nobody's ever looked at, and you want to kind of take a look at that. It's likely to contain rare species. And, depending on the part of the state, there are just different settings that are more likely to support rare species, like post-glacial sandy deltas are much more likely to have rare plants and Colchester, and so on. And that really ties into the last point here, which is protect rare plant habitat, just places that are likely to support rare plants, even if they haven't been found there. And it's also tied to the work of Vermont Conservation Design. I'm sure a lot of you have used BioFinder, but when you think about what is rare plant habitat, using BioFinder, first there is a rare and uncommon species layer where you can kind of see you can see areas where rare species are mapped. Also, just looking at the priority areas for connectivity, priority areas for forest blocks. If those areas are prioritized for protection and conservation, you're automatically going to be protecting rare species in the process. And remembering that connectivity is important for rare species too, because we know that species are likely to shift around with climate change, and plants need to be able to move around depending on the species and how they move around. Lastly, I'll leave you with this thought that, or I guess reminder that there's so much more to be found. And I think in a lot of our towns in Vermont, probably most of them, there are populations of rare plants that we don't know about. And again, we rely a lot on community scientists to report these. Naturalist has been important. An example is the small world begonia, which was thought to be extirpated from the state. It was refound a couple years ago, and that was an iNaturalist observation, initially reported that plant. Another example is purple crowberry on top of Mansfield. So I think just remembering that there is always more that is that's unmapped, and that adding to that adding to our database and adding to our understanding is just really important to building out our understanding of the natural history of Vermont. And so we really appreciate the help with that. And I'll end there.
All right, Grace, a couple of questions coming in for you. First of all, how concerned are you about invasive plants reducing biodiversity and the impact that this could have on rare plants of Vermont?
I'm concerned. Yeah, it's a, well, we have so many different invasives and it's so context dependent. And also we actually keep a spreadsheet in the department of all of our rare plants that seem to be affected by invasive species. And so, for each species are like different invasives that are affecting them. I guess just to give an example, on the lakeshore, on Lake Champlain, we have some pretty important remnant sand dunes, and they're just really susceptible to takeover by invasive species. Rugosa rose is popping up as a real threat on sand dunes. It's kind of like specifically aggressive on sand dunes, and it's outcompeting some of our populations of beach pea, which is a threatened species. So we do just kind of opportunistic management. at those priority sites, but it's really difficult to keep up, frankly, with invasives. And I think it's super important to prioritize because, eradication, it seems unlikely at this point. So it's a good point for towns to think when they're thinking about prioritization of invasives control, using those rare plant and significant natural community layers, I think can be a good way to go.
Thank you. Okay, so thoughts on the emerald ash borer and how that might result in ash species being ranked?
Yeah, that's a good question, Zap. Maine is actually adding black ash to their species of greatest conservation need list in their wildlife action plan. And um, that's really interesting that they're doing that. I think largely because it's such a culturally important species. Um, but anyway, I don't know what will happen there. We know that it happens so quickly, declines in ash. I mean, um, once the emerald ash borer kind of takes hold, it's a little bit unprecedented to have such a common. I mean, these are like S5 species, especially white ash. Um, I think it would take a lot to get them ranked. At the same time, there you could draw a comparison to butternut. We rank butternut and track healthy butternuts as S3. So we only track healthy populations, and we may go a similar route with some of these other now common species that are going to be in severe decline because of pests, where we ultimately end up tracking healthy populations. It's sort of sad to think about a future where we would do that with black ash. Um, that's sort of the one that comes to mind as being the first one we would do that with, because it's the most restricted on the landscape and the most susceptible to emerald ash borer. We also have a lot of rare species in our black ash swamps, so there's going to be some cascade effects there for the understory of black ash. So I don't quite know, but it's a good question, and we'll need to keep it in mind as we are developing our wildlife action plans, I think.
Thanks, Grace. All right, so we have 5 minutes left, and we're going to turn it over to Jens to close us out with a little bit of context.
Great. Well, Grace, that was awesome. Thank you so much for that. That was really fun to hear. So yeah, folks, I just wanted to, if I can, offer a little bit of thoughts on the municipal scale, and our work with towns, and just pick up where Grace left off. Both Dave and I work for the Community Wildlife Program, and that's part of Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department that really focuses on municipal technical assistance. So we host these webinars to really focus on that municipal audience and a lot of the issues that the department wrestles with in multiple spheres, from landowners to policy level to so forth, really do have implications for municipalities. So let's just pick up on that a little bit. The first is Grace mentioned the difference between BioFinder and the ANR Atlas. And I just wanted to clarify that the ANR Atlas is regularly updated with our newest rare plant information. And so I think Everett pushes out new updates about 4 times a year. Whereas BioFinder is more static. And so you can see much of the same information on the two, but just be aware of that difference. So at the municipal scale, we track all the town plans, bylaws, subdivision, zoning regulations, and do a complete review every 10 years. So over the last 20 years, we just completed our 3rd review of all the town plans, and there's really been a dramatic increase in the number of town plans that include biological habitat heritage inventory data, up 14% between 2009 and 2020. and in particular, maps showing rare, threatened, and endangered species are included in about 73% of the town plans we mapped. So the specific numbers, we read 236 of them, and 173 of them actually included that map data. So that's great. On paper, with these town plans, it looks like we're doing really well in terms of calling attention to these issues at the municipal level. As you all well know, Vermont towns have the authority to regulate development. The state believes that development should be regulated at that scale because that's where the impacts are felt. So the way towns go about their business with respect to development review is really important. So the town plan is a great first step. That sets the aspirational language. But let's just be clear, that is really aspirational language. And the number of zoning codes or subdivision ordinances, other actual protection mechanisms fall far behind the aspirational language that you see in the town plans. So it's great that we're flagging this, but we need to do more to actually protect these. So let me just give you a couple examples in the minutes we have left. In the municipality of Enosburg Falls, yes, that is different than the town of Enosburg. They in the zoning, it's a unified zoning and subdivision bylaw. And, they have a specific rare, threatened, and endangered species standard, a design standard that applicants should provide information about the existence and location of rare species, and applicants shall take all reasonable measures to protect all identified rare, threatened, and endangered species. So that's pretty good. That's great that they have to provide the information. A lot of that comes from the atlas. And it's great that applicants shall take reasonable measures, though what reasonable means may change from one town to the next, or even one landowner to the next. Another example of the type of protections we're seeing at the town level are overlay districts. Here is Biofinder at the right, showing rare, threatened, and endangered species in the town of Rockingham. And so you'll see that there's a huge concentration of those close to the Connecticut River. And so then as we look at the zoning for Rockingham, that purple color is an overlay district. So they lumped a lot of the rare species habitat into this overlay district, added a new set of standards beyond the underlying zoning to protect those plants. But let's just be clear, a lot of what happens in terms of these municipal regulations, the timing of it all really matters. If an applicant files for a development proposal in the middle of winter, how the town handles that with respect to actually doing field inventory can mean all the difference for the protection of those species. So that's a huge piece. I'll just add that Mapping Vermont's Natural Heritage is a great document for learning about some of the conservation goals and the strategies for protecting rare, threatened, and endangered species. And of course, it's overwhelmingly hunters and anglers that pay for conservation, even plant conservation in Vermont. And anyone can support this work through the purchase of a habitat stamp or donations to the Non-Game Wildlife Fund. So coming in at 1 minute after the hour, again, thank you all so very much for sticking with us. Grace, thank you for your expertise in doing this webinar with us. Really fun to have you all with us. Have a good day, everyone. Take care now.
Thanks, everybody.